Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about the impact of homophobia and heterosexism in society. So this is the third episode in my series called Critical Awareness about Homophobia. You can watch the full series on my YouTube channel. And basically, critical awareness about any social problem is truthfully answering four questions. Where does this problem stem from? How does this problem work? What impact does this problem have? And who benefits from it? Because truthfully answering those four questions gives us the ability to effect meaningful and lasting change. The ability to address this problem on all these four levels, which is the only effective approach. Because when it comes to complex and long-lived problems like sexism, racism, homophobia, classism, then only this multi-level approach is effective. So, in previous videos, we talked about the historical roots of homophobia and major mechanisms of homophobia, heterosexism, the ways in which they work in a culture. And today, I will talk about the impact. So, now there's going to be some data, some figures about the impact of homophobia in the world today. Not a million years ago, but today, right now. So here's the thing. Between one half and two-thirds of LGBT youth report being bullied in childhood, which forces 30% of those kids to skip or even drop out of school. And very specifically, among American high school LGBT students, bullying affects 9 out of 10. Like, what a huge figure. But the first mind-blowing finding in my research was that about 40%, nearly one half, of homeless teenagers living in the streets of major American cities identify as LGBTQ. So there's this disproportionate amount of LGBTQ people among homeless teenagers, and it's disproportionate compared to the amount of LGBT people in the general population. So then the question becomes, what does this disproportion tell us? Like, what does this picture tell us? Well, it basically tells us that those are the kids who were kicked out of their homes by their own families when those families found out that they were gay or trans. And it's not something that can only happen after those kids, came out. Because if they live in homophobic families, if they understand that it's not safe to be open about their orientation or identity with their families, with the people that they depend on for shelter and food and basically survival, then, those kids are not so stupid that they would come out. But those parents can basically learn about their kids' orientation or gender identity, if they find some materials on their computers or maybe some dating apps on their phones. So, when those parents discover that their kids are gay or trans, they just throw them out of their own homes. Probably thinking that they're doing the good thing, probably thinking that, those kids will just fix themselves and then come back. But here's the hard truth. Homelessness is a horrible trauma, but what does this trauma specifically mean at this age? What does it mean specifically in teenage years? So it means the exclusion from education and most probably the exclusion from workforce in the future. It means exposure to criminal activities, drug abuse, prostitution, promiscuity, human trafficking. So, those kids are being marginalized and exposed to this trauma by their own families. This is what's going on. And, it's not a million years ago in some third world country. Like, it is happening today in America. This is what America looks like today. So, there's also another piece of data that's very important, and it deals with mental health. I talk a lot about mental health and mental health stigma in my work. So, specifically when it comes to the impact of homophobia and heterosexism on mental health, it turns out that lesbian and gay teens are 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide compared to their age-matched straight and cisgender peers. And transgender teenagers are 10 times more likely to consider suicide. And those figures are only true when LGBT teenagers find themselves in accepted environments. Like even in accepted environments, those risks are so much higher. But if they find themselves in hostile, hateful environments, or going through this trauma like homelessness, then the risk of contemplating suicide increases to 9 times when it comes to gay and lesbian teens, and 20 times higher when it comes to transgender teenagers when compared to their straight and cisgender peers. So that's the hard reality. Stigma, bullying, rejection, isolation suffered over the years, where human personality is normally being shaped and when the foundation of adult life is normally being laid. All those things leave real, deep, and disfiguring scars on LGBT lives. And unfortunately, way too often, the worst is yet to come for the survivors in adulthood, because discrimination, it starts young, but it continues all the way into adulthood. And there is another shocking piece of data that I found in my research that, in Western Europe, this region that is commonly believed to be the most LGBT accepting region of the world, where pro-equality laws and measures were pioneered, the region where, you can see gay couples being open and walking amidst the street. Like at first sight, the region where homophobia is already eradicated. But what's reality there? The reality is that according to a very recent survey, in Western Europe, 1 in 5 employees report some form of discrimination at their workplace over the last year. So this happens in the most LGBT accepting region, that 20% of adult LGBT people face some form of discrimination at work. And this is because everyday hatred, fueled by long-entrenched discriminatory stereotypes and enabled by lack of effective pro-equality laws and effective cultural messages that fight homophobia and heterosexism, it inflicts multilateral damage on this vulnerable minority of people. And this damage, it spans from education to housing to employment to healthcare. It's actually multilateral. Even in those most accepting regions of the world, LGBT people face far higher risks of joblessness, poverty, food insecurity, and depression. And while for them, homophobia and heterosexism represents a personal tragedy, but for a larger society, and for straight people, homophobia translates into an enormous, wanton waste of human potential, talent, creativity, and productivity. There was, this pilot study by the World Bank that was done in 2015, where it was found that the exclusion of LGBT people from education and workplace globally results in the loss of economic output equal to $32 billion a year. This is a shit ton of money. It's, the size of the economy of a country like India. And this is the cost of homophobia. This is the cost that we pay collectively. It's not only gay and trans people who pay it, but it's society as a whole that pays it, because this is the money that could have gone to things like healthcare, education, public housing, those things that we always claim we don't have enough money for. And importantly, this economic loss in our society, it's not the kind of inevitable loss. It's not the kind of loss that happens as a result of, hurricanes or some other natural disasters, or even as a result of global warming. But it is the loss that is completely self-inflicted through our culture. And, I talk a lot about economic damage when it comes to issues of social justice, because it's important to understand and it's important to incorporate in our big picture of understanding those processes. But no money can measure the impact of physical violence that is happening against LGBT people globally. Because, here's the thing. In more than 76 countries that are home to more than 3 billion people, which is 1/2 of the Earth population, Today, there are still laws that criminalize private, consensual, adult same-sex relationships. And at least 5 countries expose their LGBT citizens to the risk of death penalty when they are discovered as gay or trans. So it's like, here's the thing, like, homophobic violence is basically sponsored by governments and it's normalized by governments. And it's hard to get reliable figures about it because, it is widespread, it is routinely normalized, and in the majority of the world, it is committed with barbaric cruelty. And I know it's hard to listen about it, especially if you're yourself LGBTQ. But we need to really understand it. We need to really understand and know it, as appalling and traumatic as it is, because murder victims of hate crimes are found mutilated, severely burned, castrated, showing signs of sexual assault. And most of the time, this is the barbaric cruelty with which those crimes are being perpetrated. And most of the times, perpetrators get away with it. No matter whether they're hateful individuals or extremist groups supported by the governments and sponsored by the governments, because this is happening in many countries. Also, torture and physical abuse of LGBT people in places of detention is widely documented around the world. And in those places, it has been perpetrated by police officers or prison guards or even other prisoners, all the while state agents turn a blind eye on it. Lesbian women in places of detention undergo so-called punitive rapes in order to correct them. Gay men undergo humiliating procedures like anal examination, which are tantamount to torture. In many countries, there are involuntary treatments for homosexuality that include castration or, electroshock therapy, which is basically electrocuting a person's brain. It leaves permanent brain damage. And this is happening today. This is not happening a million years ago. This is happening today. And, there are some countries where transgender people also undergo unwanted surgical sterilization. And here's the thing, that from sustained verbal attacks and homophobic slurs by middle school bullies to these horrors committed by adult bigots and sponsored by those governments, these are the lengths that homophobia can go. And this is the range of the impact that it has today. And I know that all of that is appalling and traumatic, but why it is important to know it, why it is important to talk about it, and why it's important to understand it and to be aware of it. It's so because the impact, this horrible impact of homophobia is not readily visible. Especially if you live in the Western world, especially if hate crimes are not happening on your doorstep, if there are, no crosses burning in your yard, if you live in a country where gay people have visibility, where gay people, are visible in some positions of power, in some positions of success in the entertainment industry. So it's not readily visible that the impact of homophobia, the continuing impact of homophobia is millions of lives and millions of dollars. And it's not readily visible to you, even if you're yourself gay or trans, because it can be the case that your status, your class, your money, or your place of residence informs sort of a safety bubble that keeps you far away from the exposure to the trauma that the majority of your community around the world continues to face on a daily basis. And denying the impact of homophobia and heterosexism just because your individual ass is safe, it's basically a function of privilege. And this is one of the most common blocks to the eradication of homophobia and heterosexism. In this regard, I cannot but remember that 3 years ago in 2016, I emailed one pro-equality organization based in California. This was an organization founded by some very successful photographers, and they had a lot of media connections, and they could basically help me with my project. So I contacted them, and I wanted to have a conversation about my book and how we could possibly collaborate on that. And here was their response. They said, Jorge, we don't think that your work is necessary anymore because with the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide, which happened 1 year before that, we believe that equality has arrived to America, and its tide will eventually spread worldwide. And I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a typically American rhetoric, to think that everything good that happens in America will eventually spread worldwide. But it was so full of bullshit, and it was so nearsighted, even in the context of the United States as a country, because I received this response 2 months before the Orlando shooting, which not only was a flagrant act of homophobic violence, but it was also the it was the deadliest mass shooting in the history of the United States. And then I had those people tell me 2 months before that homophobia is eradicated. There's no need for pro-equality projects. There's no need for pro-equality messages and for stories like I had to tell that are destined to fight homophobia and heterosexism in an innovative and really daring way. And I received this response 8 months before. There were 52 anti-LGBT bills introduced across the United States after Trump's elections. And among those bills was this notorious North Carolina HB2, which banned transgender people from using bathrooms based on their chosen gender. So this is the reality, and it was easy for those folks who lived in California, in that region of the country where homophobia is not so visible, because they were safe from violence, they were safe from the exposure to this trauma. So it was easy for them to believe homophobia is already over, it's already confined to the pages of history. But it's not. We need to understand that homophobia is a continual reality, and homophobic violence is a continual reality. And so the impact of it is our reality today, and there's a lot of work to be done in this regard in order to eradicate it. And it's also important to talk about the impact of homophobia, because this data about the economical part of this impact, it completely controverts the myth of not being affected. The myth that straight people are conditioned to believe as part of heterosexual privilege. This myth that gives us a license to avoid conversations about homophobia and heterosexism. Because as you can see from this data, straight people are also affected by homophobia, in a different way than gay and trans people are, but they are also affected. Just, through those socioeconomic mechanisms, just like men are affected by sexism, and just like white people are affected by racism, because there's an increasing amount of evidence showing how social injustice affects entire society economically. So we're talking about money here. We lose economic output as the inevitable consequence of wasting human potential. And this is the consequence of discrimination. This is the consequence of building walls and glass ceilings instead of giving people equal opportunity. And this is why growing critical awareness about those issues in the area of intersectional social justice, issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, growing critical awareness about those things is key to building not only a fairer, more spiritual, and more connected society, but also a more economically effective and a more prosperous society, which I think is what we all want very wholeheartedly. So I hope you take this message on a positive note. As always, I would love to have a conversation with y'all, so please do leave me a comment below. And if you find this video insightful and helpful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will catch you next time on Jorge Ora's YouTube channel. Be brave, show up, stay curious, and take care. Bye.